I'm Chris Field. I'm the director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here for a conversation on California's climate policy, what we've accomplished and what hasn't been accomplished, how it relates to national policy in other states, and policies around the world. It's an exciting opportunity to continue a dialogue about ways that everybody can be engaged and about opportunities for moving a broad agenda. Let me just say a few things about the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, and let me express my gratitude and excitement about working with Resources for the Future. This is the first event that we've done in partnership with Resources for the Future. So approximately 15 years ago, Stanford realized that it was strong in academics, but it wasn't really having the kind of impact in the solutions space that was consistent with the institution's broad goals, and started a series of policy institutes that were really focused on, well, our motto is practical solutions for people in the climate, people in the planet, I'm sorry, and across a broad agenda that includes work on climate, water, food, health, oceans, and policy. We have science that digs into the underlying mechanisms, work on the psychology of how people understand these, on the education of how to embed knowledge in progress going forward, and on the policy of how issues get shaped in local, state, national, international dialogues. One of the things that we try and do is find ways to share results, to share input, and to share conversations with dedicated groups around the world. And we found these National Press Club events to be a terrific opportunity, not only for a distinguished panel to share some of their knowledge, but also for us to be informed about things that are happening around the world and to get the ideas that come from a two-way conversation. And if there's anything that's the hallmark of the Woods approach, it's been that progress comes from co-production, co-led conversations, and I want to use this as the starting point for my assignment to all of you, which is the success of today's event is going to depend as much on the insight that comes from your questions as on what I'm sure will be deep insight that comes from each of our panelists. This is our first event this year. As I said, I'm excited to do it with Resources for the Future. Most of you, all of you, I'm sure know Resources for the Future is a distinguished, nonpartisan think tank that provides policy information that supports action at many different levels. The partnership is a really good one. RFF is focused on bringing issues into the dialogue for policy, and at Woods we're focused on the core understanding, on the communications, and on bringing things up to the level where they make sense at this policy interface. And I'm excited that moving forward we're going to have opportunities to take a lot more advantage of this kind of partnership, especially in an environment where the challenges to moving forward with policy on the environment are substantially more complicated and more requiring of deep and important thought than has often been the case in the past. The format for today's events is we'll have brief opening comments from each of our distinguished speakers. I'll ask a few questions, and while I'm asking questions, I'm looking forward to each of you thinking about the issues that you'd like to go into in more depth. We're going to finish today by about 1:45, but I hope we'll have at least half of the time will be available for questions from you and a chance to really have this be a conversation. Let me say a few words about each of our panelists. So the first comments are going to be from Michael Wara. Michael's a senior research scholar at the Woods Institute. He's one of the very few people I know who, in addition to being a distinguished legal scholar, is also a distinguished oceanographer. He's worked for decades on the interface between science and policy and climate, and is a real expert in providing nonpartisan advice to stakeholders who are interested in developing climate policies and understanding the likely impacts of different avenues of climate policy development. The next speaker is going to be Dallas Bertraw. Dallas is a senior fellow at Resources for the Future and one of the world's leading experts in electricity markets and the implications of variations in electricity policy for the broad agenda of decarbonization. The final speaker is going to be Kit Batten. Kit is currently the climate resilience chief at PG&E. She's had a distinguished career in a number of Washington-based and California-based organizations. She's been at the U.S. Agency for International Development. She's been at, she was science advisor to the Deputy Secretary for Department of Interior, and has really been involved in climate policy advice over a wide range of institutions and perspectives. At PG&E, she really drives the agenda of not only figuring out how to cope with climate change, but how to make the power system resilient. Looking forward to comments from all three of our distinguished speakers. Michael, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks very much for pardon me, having me today. I'm going to be the only person who shows a few slides, and I thought these might be helpful to frame the conversation today and to explain where California has been in terms of climate policy over the last decade. We really embarked on this journey about 10 years ago as a state, perhaps a little bit before that. And then also to talk a little bit about the ambition of the next decade in California and how different it is than where we've been and the challenges ahead and the things that will have to be overcome for California to achieve its climate objectives. So the figure's a little small, but hopefully you can see that this is a figure that just illustrates California's emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from about the year 2000 to 2015. And there's a little step change in those emissions. It looks like a relatively flat figure, and then there's a step downward as you move toward the present. That step is the recession. The recession had a large impact on emissions. Emissions were at about 480 million tons prior to the recession, and currently we don't exactly know current emissions, but it looks based on sort of preliminary data from the Air Resources Board that we're down at somewhere below 200 and somewhere between 230 and 240 million. 430 and 440 million tons today. So about 40 to 50 million tons below our peak emissions pre-recession. A number of policies have had an impact on that. The recession obviously had a major impact, but so did the fact that electricity load, the demand for electric power, has been largely flat in the state of California due to a variety of factors. State policy aimed at energy efficiency, also the gradual transformation of the California economy toward a more services-oriented model of GDP growth, and technological innovation, right? The advent of especially efficient lighting and HVAC technologies, which was partly a result of policy and partly a result of market-driven effects. In addition, and this is a place where policy has had a major impact, California doesn't make all of its own electric power. We import about a quarter of our power, between a third and a quarter, depending on the year. And the composition of those imports has fundamentally changed over the last decade, moving away from coal toward greater imports of hydro, other renewables, and natural gas. That has had a large impact on California's statewide emissions. We account for the emissions associated with electric power that's imported into the state in our inventory. In addition, of course, California has some of the most ambitious renewable portfolio standards in the country. We have a 33% target for 2020, which the state utilities are well on track, including PG&E, are well on track to meeting. There's a 50% target for 2030, and there is at least discussion of a 100% renewables target for some point in the future, perhaps 2040 or 2045, although that's a legislative proposal at this point and not a law in California. All of this has been accomplished, this fall in emissions, gradual, dramatic fall during the recession, then a gradual decline thereafter, despite the fact that one of our nuclear power plants retired unexpectedly in the middle of this interval. In 2011, the San Onofre nuclear generating station retired and was had to be, the power had to be replaced on a sort of emergency basis. That resulted in an 11 million ton increase in the in-state emissions associated with electric power as natural gas plants were ramped up to fill the gap left by the retirement of that station. And so California has stayed on track despite that retirement, and that's a fairly remarkable accomplishment. I should say that most of the, well, not most, essentially all of the emissions reductions to date have come from the electric power sector in California. That is where the lion's share of the work has been done, and that's incredibly important as we think about achieving the 2020 target and the 2030 target for reasons I'll explain on the next slide. So this slide is the same figure, but with two red lines. The upper red line is the 2020 target. This figure, which is the official sort of certified final numbers from ARB, shows that in 2015 we were close. The preliminary data from reporting of the 2016 emissions information from covered sources under the cap and trade strongly suggests that we are already below the 2020 target. So California has achieved the target early. The 2030, and notice that the difference between where emissions were at the advent of the program and that target is relative, it's substantial, but it's modest in comparison with the drop that has to come to hit the 2030 target, right? Emissions will had to fall about 50 million tons to achieve the 2020 goal. To get from 2020 to 2030, they have to fall 140 million tons or so. Much larger reduction. If you think about it on an annual basis, it's about a 10x rate of decline, increase in the rate of decline in emissions. So the level of ambition is ramping up in California. This is particularly challenging because, as I mentioned, the reductions to date have largely been in the power sector. Imported electricity is much cleaner than it was at the advent of the program, and the electricity produced within the state is also much cleaner, much lower carbon than it was at the advent of the program because of state policy, because of the evolving costs of competing technologies, and because of the effect of markets, the organized wholesale market, on which generators produce energy in the system. There's some basic arithmetic that I think everyone who thinks about California needs to consider. We have about this, and this is using the 2015 data, about 84 million tons of electricity emissions left in California. I think if we actually had the current data, the number is probably closer to 70 million tons, maybe a little bit below that. So we have 70 million tons of power sector emissions left. We have 140 million tons to get to that 2030 target. And the balance has to come from somewhere else. What are those other places? Industrial emissions and transportation emissions. Transportation emissions under a suite of California policies aimed at transforming the vehicle sector are actually growing, right? The problem that California faces, like the rest of the country, is that oil prices have been low due to other kinds of technological innovation in the United States. And as a result, consumers are choosing vehicles and that consume greater amounts of fuel, produce greater amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, and they're also driving more. California has had extensive efforts to try to reduce vehicle miles traveled that haven't worked as intended. And there's a rethink that's happening right now about those policies, but it's not been a successful approach so far. So in order to achieve the 2030 goal in California, transportation emissions are going to have to change, probably in concert with changes in how process heat is generated. And this is a fundamental climate change challenge that I think if technological solutions can be developed, there may be opportunities to really spread that learning across to other jurisdictions. But low carbon process heat is also going to be an important precondition of success for California. And so with that, I'll pass it to Dallas to talk more about some of the policies that are getting us there.
Great. That was a very good introduction. I just want to say several people have asked me what the story is behind my black eye, and I just want to say that economics is a tough field. I want to pick up where Michael left off, and he went through a litany of various approaches and changes that are occurring in different sectors. And so there's one impression that people, I think, outside California carry, and that is that California's climate policy is about cap and trade. Well, cap and trade is a very important part of California's climate policy, but a more important part, a substantially more important part, is a menu of policies, standards, and measures that directly introduce regulations into the regulated sectors. In this decade, the California Scoping Plan, their legally mandated scoping plan, outlines over 80% of the emission reductions that have been achieved and will be achieved by 2020 were identified by the Air Resources Board with specific standards and measures, leaving less than 20% to be sort of cleaned up by the cap and trade program to make sure that the emissions cap is attained. Now, going forward in the next decade, the scoping plan, which is just sort of a planning document, it's not a specific set of regulations, but it's an outline for the state's ambitions. The standards and measures that have been identified have shown about 60 to 62% of the emission reductions that are going to be necessary, meaning that there's basically a doubling, we might like to think of, in terms of the influence that carbon pricing will play in, notionally speaking, in achieving the goals for the next decade. So that warms the heart of economists, and that we like to see that this expanding influence of prices will lead to greater cost effectiveness and give greater incentives for innovation. But I, for one, don't think that it would have been possible to achieve these emission reductions now or in the next decade on the back of carbon pricing alone, because California is acting alone. It's exposed to competition from other states and internationally from jurisdictions that don't price carbon or indeed may subsidize carbon. So California is doing this balancing act of trying to put together a suite of policies that achieve the overall goals and trying to introduce carbon pricing, which can be a model for the world, while also putting in specific regulations in place that drive innovation and make technology available for the world. Obviously, California policies have to interact with federal policies in a really important way, and that climate has changed. But we're talking about California today, but I want to just take a second and recognize the efforts of states across the nation. In one sense, it was the innovation in energy efficiency, renewable energy, the RPS programs, and carbon pricing that created the technical basis of the Obama administration's rulemaking on the Clean Power Plan. And to get ready for a big overreach here, but that Clean Power Plan enabled China to come into negotiations with the US, and that China entering the negotiations with the US enabled the Paris Accord. So at least a plausible statement can be made that the leadership of the states, while not sufficient to achieve any strong climate impact directly, has a huge policy impact in helping to support and enable progress that's made on the international stage. But now we have retreat at the federal level on the Clean Power Plan, likely retreat, expected retreat on the vehicle standards. There's 15 states that have signed on that can follow California's leadership, as California has exclusive authority to meet or exceed federal standards for vehicle efficiency, but other states then have an option of either following California's lead or sticking with the federal standard. 15 states follow California's lead on this, and this is going to be one of the real battlegrounds over the next months and years. And then third, I want to just mention, to give you the vocabulary of one of the discussions that are happening in Sacramento this winter and spring, will be the so-called overhang. So Michael mentioned that California is achieving its goals ahead of the expected deadline for 2020, at least on pace and perhaps ahead of that. And as a consequence, some of the emission allowances that would be available associated with those goals haven't been used for compliance. And indeed, the state is holding a couple major buckets of these. One bucket are allowances that didn't sell in the auction because their auction has a price floor. And for 2 or 3 auctions in a row, the price fell to that price floor. So there's a bunch of allowances that didn't sell. And then there's another bunch that the state explicitly clawed out of each annual cap and held into a reserve in case the price ever went too high, and that they would then re-enter the program at a higher price. So this tranche of allowances, some argue, is so large and might be bought on the cheap by regulated firms that it could undermine the state's goals to achieve legislatively required emission goals in the next decade. It adds up to, it's quite a large amount of allowances. Whether this is a problem or an opportunity depends on whether you view the glass as half full or half empty. Remembering that California has a long-run climate goal and it has to get past 2030, and it has a price floor and a price ceiling, exactly how in the cap and trade program, exactly how this all works out in the long run remains to be seen. But the key thing is that the way that things go forward, California has a scoping plan, which I mentioned, and they've now just come out with their third scoping plan. But there now is, over the next year, going to be specific rulemaking implementing that scoping plan. All the rules for the cap and trade program, the rules for the low carbon fuel standard, the rules for all the other standards and measures that I mentioned. And it is in that process that the Air Resources Board will balance what to do about this overhang of allowances. And so I just want to point to earlier this month, Mary Nichols, the well-known chair of the Air Resources Board, testified before the legislature and said that she recognized that there's a tension between the desire to keep prices moderate and predictable and relatively smooth versus the desire to use price of allowances to drive more aggressive action. And she acknowledged that in the past, there's no question they took the side of the former. That is, moderating prices, keeping the program smooth. But she also acknowledged that it's becoming time now to see prices doing more, in my words, prices doing more of the work in terms of driving incentives for innovation and investing in things that are going to help achieve the long-run climate goals. So I expect to see the Air Resources Board move towards some increase in prices and seeing prices do more of the work, which aligns with the expanding influence of cap and trade in achieving California's climate goals. So now let me kick it to Kit.
Thanks, and so much. It's such a pleasure to be back here at the National Press Club. I live in California now. I was in DC for over 11 years, so it's really nice to be back, and I hope you all are happy that I brought some California weather with me. So we in California are not only really focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but are also working on trying to make sure that we're building resilience of the state to climate change impacts, which unfortunately we're already experiencing. And although we don't quite yet have the same sort of level of regulatory kind of engagement with the state, that type of regulation and legislation is building. And Pacific Gas and Electric is definitely at the table trying to make sure that we're working with the state on advancing that agenda. So just a little bit of information on PG&E for those of you who might not be aware. We cover about 2/3 of the state of California and are both an electric and a natural gas utility. Our service area is 70,000 square miles. We've got 24,000 employees and serve over 5 million electric customers and over 4 million natural gas customers. Our power mix right now for electricity is 70% greenhouse gas free. That includes 33% of defined renewables, about 12% of large hydropower, and then the rest of that from nuclear power. The rest of the mix comes from natural gas or from the wholesale market that Michael was describing earlier. So we're part of the We're Still In initiative and remain committed to the goals of the Paris Accord, and of course remain committed to further reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. We're also now, as of January, the position that I now have at PG&E is a brand new role for the company, and resilience is becoming increasingly a very important part of the work that we do. So just a few words about climate change impacts in the state of California. We think that the year of 2017, unfortunately, demonstrates the type of extreme events and change that we're expecting to only see more of in the future with a changing climate. We had the hottest summer on record in California and the third hottest year in global history. The strongest winter storm season in 50 years. The June to July rainy season for 2017 is 180% of normal precipitation. However, right now we're at 74% of normal precipitation and only 23% of snow water equivalent in our Sierra snowpack. So we're seeing this kind of ping pong in terms of the type of precipitation we're getting and as well as the amount. Of course, we've also seen the largest and most destructive wildfire season in the state, followed by very tragic mudslides. So that's a huge issue. And of course, that's just in California. Beyond, we've seen 3 of the largest hurricanes in the Atlantic this year affecting the United States, both here in the mainland as well as in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So what are we going to do about this? So we're trying to figure out and project into both the relatively near future. Our next general rate case for PG&E is from 2020 to 2022. And so we're trying to predict as early as 2022 kind of what are some of the climate change impacts that we expect to see within our service area. And then more broadly into 2050 for planning purposes, what do we expect to see in our service area? And for PG&E, climate resilience is really about making sure that we're building the resilience not just of the company, of our infrastructure and operations and employee safety, but also the safety of the communities that we serve. And so trying to take that broad-ranging approach to how we're defining resilience. We've been focusing on 6 different climate change drivers to begin with. One is sea level rise, of course, and most recent reports have shown that we're expecting in San Francisco between 7 and 23 inches of sea level rise by 2050. And that's without storm surge or flooding from storms in combination with it. It's a massive amount of potential sea level rise. We're expected to see more and more extreme heat events. Threatening vulnerable populations in the state, increasing wildfire risk. Right now, 40% of California's land mass is at either extreme or very extreme wildfire risk. Stronger storms and changing precipitation patterns, drought, and also land subsidence related to groundwater pumping during drought. So all of these things, trying to make sure that we're factoring in this modeling. And we're examining how this kind of changing new normal, because that's the thing, right? We can't now just say, okay, now is our new normal. Now we can change all of our thinking to fit this model. It's going to be a changing iterative process in terms of defining what a new normal is. So how do we build that information into new infrastructure and into maintenance of infrastructure, into safety, into new design standards, engineering design standards for our equipment, into our business model as we're exploring investing in more and more electric vehicles to help the state meet emission reduction goals, and as the mix of electricity becomes more and more renewable and not necessarily intermittent renewable electricity, what are we doing about battery storage and our operations, and also just integrated resource planning for the future. As we're experiencing more and more, last summer, we had a 109-degree heat wave in the city of San Francisco. Nobody has air conditioning in San Francisco. So as we're trying to figure out what our power demand is going to be moving into the future with this changing climate regime, what does that mean in terms of our planning purposes? And so we're doing a number of different things. We're engaging with the state, and the state has done a lot of really good work. They've created a technical advisory council to the governor's office to try and work on figuring out how the state and local governments can be working together in order to address climate resilience. Because unfortunately, not that reducing emissions is easy, but at least you've got a metric that everyone can kind of grasp onto, carbon dioxide equivalent reduction. But when you're talking about climate change resilience, the impacts are so diverse and they differ from area to area. So trying to come up with a systematic program for how to be dealing with this and measuring how we're being successful or not is challenging. And so we're very pleased to be sitting on the Technical Advisory Council. We have a couple of grant programs that we're involved in. We launched a Better Together Resilient Communities grant program last March, focusing on a different climate change impact each year. And we'll be doing another request for proposals in March of this year. Last year, we were able to award UC Merced, the Karuk tribe, which is located in northwestern California, Ag Innovations in Sonoma County, and the Sierra Institute for Workout in Lassen County, all trying to figure out how best to be managing our forests and our watersheds in the face of increasing wildfire risk. And that's a $2 million program over 5 years. And we've got a number of things going on internally as well. How long am I going over my 5 minutes?
I think you're fine.
1 more minute, okay. So internally, we've built in a governance structure, a lot of really it's about change management. PG&E, like I said, has 24,000 employees, so trying to figure out how to integrate information about a changing new normal into the standard business practices and work plans for employees across the company, we've been taking a very close look at where we can start interjecting this new information into existing project development cycles, et cetera, design standards like I mentioned earlier, so that we can make it as seamless as possible. We're investing in trainings for our workforce as well. We've got ongoing research to make sure that we're keeping abreast of the latest and greatest science on climate change. And we're developing a series of tools to help us screen large infrastructure projects over $20 million to not only look at whether or not they're vulnerable to any of these climate change impacts, but whether they're going to be sensitive to those climate change impacts. Developing metrics, like I mentioned before, and really trying to work on doing what we're calling deep dives across our service area, looking at different climate change impacts, how they integrate with one another, because those 6 drivers I mentioned are not all independent of each other, and looking across our lines of business to try and increase resilience. So it's an exciting time.
Thanks so much. And well, why don't you join me in thanking all of the speakers for their opening comments. And let me just comment on the extent to which we've really heard about top to bottom, all hands on deck approach to thinking about the climate issue. And we've heard about a number of opportunities and a number of challenges. I think an interesting way to approach this is let's start with a little bit of a deep dive into what's happening in California with efforts both on the supply side and the demand side for energy, as well as on the side of building resilience, and then extend outward to the implications of that for interactions with neighbors, interactions at the national and the international scale. And I might start out with Michael with a question about implications of the emissions reductions that have occurred so far. And the question is there evidence about whether the efforts so far have damaged or helped the California economy?
Well, I think the evidence is that they haven't had a large impact on the economic growth in the state or employment in the state. It's certainly the case that there are many more residents of the state of California that work in the renewable energy industry than there were prior to the advent of the state's energy and climate portfolio of programs. But I think the best evidence is that if the impact is measurable, it is extremely modest, and it's so small that it's hard to know whether the sign is positive or negative. The one place where I think there is a clear impact is in terms of the companies that are starting in California, right? We've seen a real emergence of an interest in a large set of companies that are in the energy innovation space, electricity innovation, providing new kinds of services, new business models, new hardware, and then also, of course, in the transport space as well, where there's the one, right? There's Tesla, but there are also a large number of other companies that are starting up and are based in California and are interested in participating in the California kind of process, and that's it's impossible to know where those companies will end up, but certainly there's a lot of emergence of innovation, which I think is kind of something that California that's plays to California's comparative advantage. We have an ecosystem to fund and finance those kinds of companies that's very healthy in California, and so we're playing to our strengths, which is what we should be doing.
And if I can take that one step further, whether or not it's been positive for the economy now, it's planted a bunch of seeds with the potential to bloom in the future.
Yes.
Dallas, the issue of the role of companies is a really central one for the unfolding of this agenda. And one of the things we're seeing across the country and even around the world is big companies are demanding access to clean power for their operations. And I wonder, in California, has that been an important driver of the penetration of renewables, or is that something we're seeing more in other parts of the country?
Well, we are seeing it throughout the country. The customer-driven desire to see green energy is really important at the extensive margin, we would say, shaping where new investments will occur. I know that major data centers, for example, in other parts of the country in the Southeast have chosen to locate in states where the regulated utility will let them sign power purchase agreements to lock into 100% green, or to use renewable energy credits to essentially certify that they're 100% green, and chose not to invest in a state where they couldn't achieve that type of a guarantee. And I know this is true in California as well. One thing about this greening of the electricity grid that's so important, probably warms Kit's heart, is that as Michael said, there are about 70 million tons associated with electricity sector emissions, and the goal is 140 million tons. And it's definitely the case that California has to look beyond the electricity sector, but it's also the case that California has to grow the electricity sector. So while it's energy efficiency programs, the state agency folks will still tell you are really important to make sure that the electricity sector is handled in a smart way. It's like, when we talk about renewable portfolio standards as being, the numerator is the share that's renewable and the denominator is the amount of sales. Well, we're saying now it's time to start growing the denominator. So not only is it a push towards very high percentages of renewable as a share of electricity generation, but it's time to start growing the electricity sector for process heat, for space and water heating and cooling, and importantly, for electric vehicles. So that's where the new startup companies that, California, it is playing to California's strength because innovation is California's, self-identity. But the California economy, since 2010 or so, when California really embraced the move towards addressing greenhouse gases, has been in the top 5 in terms of per capita growth in GDP, and it has far outpaced the nation in terms of GDP growth. That doesn't tell you that it's because of or not because of the climate policies, but at least it tells you that strong economic growth is consistent with climate policies. And I think, back to your question about the companies, I think in part California is positioning itself not only for success within California, but positioning those companies for success in the nation and in the world.
Good point.
Can I just add
Please.
to that really quickly? So I think that we're also seeing a rise of activist investors in companies and boards who really want to see action along these lines. And the whole 2 degrees scenario analysis and planning movement has companies looking at what role do we play, what is our role in terms of achieving a no more than 2 degrees Celsius rise above pre-industrial levels if we were to meet the goals set out in the Paris Accord. And so that kind of work, looking across operations, et cetera, is going on at a lot of major companies in California, but beyond, of course. And so that's another kind of forcing mechanism that's, I think, driving a lot of change.
Yeah, I hope we can dig a little more into this issue, because I see a landscape in which much more of the pressure for climate action is coming from the private sector than from the public sector in lots of different places. I did want to ask about the one aspect of Dallas' point about growing the electricity markets, and what you and PG&E perceive as the big challenges of increasing the share of renewables, and how you view the issue of providing reliable electricity in the context of a grid that's got more and more intermittent power generation sources on it.
Sure. So the electricity kind of business model is changing in the state of California. We've got a lot of local generation of electricity through consumer choice aggregates, or CCAs, for those of you who are familiar. We have our analysis of PG&E's provision of electricity and the state's needs for electricity actually led us to decide last year to decommission our last nuclear power plant in the state of California, because we deemed that it was not necessary to continue operating that plant in order to meet our electricity needs. And part of that is because all of this new electricity is coming onto the grid through distributed generation. Of course, what you just said in terms of intermittent electricity means that we need to have really smart grids and understand and be able to route electricity accordingly. That's in the case of emergency situations, as well as just serving the needs of the California population. Electricity is going to continue to be a critical part of the state's growth and GDP. So trying to figure out how best to be serving those needs, increased electricity needs through electric vehicle charging as we're doing fuel switching over to electricity. And then as we're looking at a shift in our weather patterns from a resilience perspective, we're going to expect more cooling degree days, which in energy parlance means more days per year people are going to want air conditioning, so that's an increase in electricity. So figuring for how we plan for increased efficiencies as well as increased demand, and then trying also in this distributed energy network as we're managing the overall grid for 2/3 of the state, how does that actually increase our potential resilience as well when we're thinking about extreme events related to climate change impacts and other security risks?
And one theme that's central to that is something that we've heard a lot about today, but isn't really at the tip of most people's tongues, and it's this concept of process heat, the heat that you use for making stuff and heating and cooling buildings. And I wonder, maybe each of you, how you think about the demand for process heat changing, how you see us decarbonizing the process heat, and whether you see that as an asset or a liability in terms of dealing with the intermittency issues.
Well, I think the interesting thing about California, a lot of the demands for process heat in California have to do with the supply chain for transportation, right? California gets a lot of its crude oil from California, from secondary recovery involving steam injection in older oil fields in California. There's starting to be interesting experiments. So that's a process heat requirement, right? You need to make steam and inject it in the ground to get this sort of very goopy oil out. We're starting to see experiments there with some applications of concentrated solar power. There's also a process to start to think about in a more complete way about carbon capture and storage in California as a potential solution for process heat. The third option is nuclear, small modular reactors most likely, and that's kind of a non-starter under current California law until we have a long-term waste repository. That's the state of play in California. It's unlikely to change. I think that so speaking at the highest level, I think a key goal for the state of California should be to improve its relationship with the oil and gas supply chain, the regulatory relationship with those businesses to partner to solve this problem over the next decade. I think the relationship that the state has now with those industries tends to be confrontational, more confrontational perhaps than it needs to be, rather than partnership. And the state will be best served if it can partner towards solutions. And so I'm hopeful on that front, and I think there are a number of players in that industry that are interested in partnering instead of resisting, but it remains to be seen how much can be accomplished.
To that, I would just add, that was a really great answer, Michael, but I would just add that the area which doesn't get much talked about and is my favorite topic to bring up is storage. But most of us, when we think about storage, we're thinking about batteries. But there's another form of storage, which is thermal storage, which our look at this suggests it's about equal in magnitude in terms of the contribution it can make to achieving decarbonization goals. The opportunity for thermal storage is enormous. And here I'm talking about, as I mentioned earlier, pre-cooling and preheating of space and water as a way, as essentially, and using process heat when available to do so, but also taking advantage of the variable resources associated with wind and solar in different parts of the state. And when these resources are abundant, even if it's in 15-minute increments before a cloud cover comes or whatever, taking advantage of that to preheat and pre-cool buildings and water is an enormous opportunity. So I see that as another aspect in terms of what the next decade or 2 decades will have for us in terms of technological innovation.
And I don't get paid to say this, but if anybody's interested in a really innovative investment in process heat management, look at Stanford's new Central Energy Management Facility, which cut the energy requirements of the whole campus dramatically by making hot and cold water in an efficient way when energy was cheap, and then using that over an extended period to heat and cool buildings.
I don't have anything else to add.
Okay. Well, let's switch to talking about the challenges that California faces as a consequence of being a little bit of a sole actor in the climate ambition space. And one of the questions that people raise is, well, as we move into an environment where there's going to be a substantial carbon price in the cap and trade environment, how do you prevent that from encouraging especially energy demanding enterprises to move out of state? That's the challenge.
I mean, it's an enormous challenge. The current approach has been to provide energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries. That's kind of the technical term for industries that face a lot of competition because of their energy costs with free allowances, free permits under the cap and trade to insulate them from the carbon price. I think that solution can only take you so far, and as carbon prices get higher, that solution will be less effective. And so there's going to be a challenge with keeping these industries healthy in the state of California, and I think the state is going to, in the medium term, need to think hard about other tools. And the other tools that exist raise their own, the reason we have the system we have is to avoid legal complications. The other tools that exist are going to create some interesting opportunities for ARB counsel to be in court and defending the structure of the program. And
some of the other tools might be other states recognizing that there's a benefit for them being involved in climate policy in a more active way as well.
I think the hope would be that we move at least toward a regional approach, and hopefully before California gets to a very high carbon price, a federal approach, and that will make the situation much simpler to manage.
Yeah, I agree with the point is that California can only withstand so much daylight between its leadership and what other states are doing. And so if the federal policy changes and other states start to move, then California will likely continue to be an innovator and continue to be out front of whatever the federal policy is, but it can only go so far. And so this opportunity for leakage of jobs or emissions to other states is very concerning. But the converse is the sense that if you're on a virtuous cycle, California's economy continues to grow and its innovation continues to happen. And if there's an opportunity to propagate those ideas and those business opportunities to other parts of the nation and world, then California is where people want to live. So then, in that vision of the world, California can sustain this kind of challenges that are associated with economic leakage. But it's sort of a gestalt thing. Like if that, it's like the economy sometimes works that way. And if there's a big turn in the California economy, that's when it will really become challenging for California.
Kit, one of the things that makes California a compelling place to live is the resilience and a sense that there are investments in protecting people. And one of the things that I see as a challenge that PG&E and California enterprises in general face is how to think about allocating resources between investments in resilience and investments in decreasing emissions. And I wonder if, from the PG&E philosophy, those things are really trade-offs, or whether you see a space where they overlap and you're trying to concentrate efforts there.
Sure. Well, it's really amazing to be working for a company that has a vision and a mission statement that focus entirely on sustainability and the provision of clean, affordable, reliable, and safe electricity and energy, and then also says that we're going to address the climate challenge. So PG&E really sees both of those as being central tenets of our business model. I mean, we want to be evolving with the changing climate, sorry for that pun, but this is an opportunity to really be a leader, and our CEO, Geisha Williams, really is interested in the company leading across both of those sectors. And, in certain cases, investments that reduce emissions through land management, et cetera, also can have resilience co-benefits. And I would say in terms of California definitely is a leader in resilience as well, but there is a building community of practice. There's the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative. There are certainly global international initiatives to increase resilience in many countries around the world. And this really is an opportunity to be learning from each other because it is a more nascent field in terms of strategies that work. And funding gets brought up a lot. You know, how are we going to fund all of this resilience that we need across the globe on an annual basis? But one of the ways that we're going to fund it is through the private sector kind of building an understanding of projected climate change impacts into the DNA and operations. So very excited to be part of that.
I do want to turn to questions from the audience, and we'll have a microphone runner available. I'm going to ask one more question, though. Just so this is to give you a chance to think about your question, not to have you ask it right now. And I just wanted to follow up on one more aspect of this interface between investments in resilience and investments in emissions reductions. And one of the things that strikes me is that we tend to focus a lot on the supply side when we talk about decarbonizing, but of course a lot of the opportunities are on the demand side through whether it's appliance efficiency or vehicle efficiency or building insulation. And I wonder if each of you feels like we've got a set of incentives in place that are appropriately distributed across the demand side and the supply side, and whether awareness of the resilience implications is something we need to think more about. And Kit, maybe you could start with that.
Sure. Well, I mean, the state of California and the investor-owned utilities, municipal utilities, have been leading on trying to invest in demand-side customer solutions for energy efficiency, et cetera, if that's part of your question. I'm not as familiar with PG&E's programs, but I know that we've got a significant suite of programs to work across our service area, and in particular with disadvantaged communities, so that they can be investing in lower emission solutions and saving money along the way. In terms of incentives for resilience, I don't think we have that per se, but what we do have is a regulatory entity in the state of California, the California Public Utilities Commission, is very interested in working with the investor-owned utilities on how to be incorporating this changing new normal into our business model. And so trying to figure out, every investment that PG&E makes is based on various cost-benefit analyses, and incorporating new information about this changing new normal into those decision-making processes, and having the CPUC be there with us through this process, because we're all learning at the same time, I guess is the closest I can come to an incentive.
Well, having a chance to hear Kit answer gave me a second to think, and so a couple ideas leapt into mind. For that, one is California's legislation from 3 or 4 years ago, SB 375, which is
Yes, that's right.
which is aimed at communities and community planning. As part of a general plan for a community, there's all sorts of elements that range from traffic to noise to all sorts of things that are part of a community's so-called constitution under which future planning has to occur. That's the general plan framework. And as part of that, now 375 provides a requirement and incentives for considering greenhouse gas impacts of local land use, transportation planning, the organization of subdivisions, all this sort of thing. So there is an incentive to local governments.
And resilience as well.
And resilience is
it required for city planning now after September or January of this last year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the community choice aggregators, which are, we might invite Kit to elaborate on that, because I know that's I think the company probably sees the good and bad side of relating to the CCAs. But one element of this is the movement away from large central station power plants in California. Many people I feel intuitively, because I'm not really a technologist, but some technologists have explained to me that indeed they see it this way too, that it suggests greater resilience because the grid is not so vulnerable to disruption from service from one central plant, but that there's distributed generation throughout the grid. And third, I think I'll kick this over to Michael now because he'll probably have more to say about this. But a third element of resilience really comes back, Kit mentioned disadvantaged communities. And I think that we can't go all the way on talking about California programs without talking about the really special consideration that has been earned by disadvantaged communities. And it's really, through the success of legislation over the last couple of years, part and parcel of that success in designing a climate policy at the state level has been very specific monitoring and reporting and measures to address air quality issues in disadvantaged communities. And part of also the auction revenues, a substantial portion of auction revenues, I guess it's 25% of auction revenues have to be in communities that are designated as disadvantaged, and 35% of those investments have to work to the benefit of those communities. And this is so important, not just, I mean, the cost of climate change, the disadvantaged communities have fewer resources to respond to suddenly changing climate or heat storms or what have you. But it's also created a political coalition. Like sometimes people ask, why can this happen in California? And we've talked about a lot of the things that have happened that make that possible, like the culture of innovation, and there are green preferences in California. But California, you know, has had more years since the 60s, has had substantially more years with a Republican governor than with a Democratic governor. So it's not unarguably a left-leaning Democratic state. But what they have done is put together a coalition that in the big fight over the last couple of years, I like if I can invoke a Lord of the Rings picture in your mind, there was, especially in 2016, at the last minute, a third army rose over the hill. And it was right when the refineries and were tussling with the governor's office, this third army showed up, and it was the environmental justice movement folks. And it was sort of unpredictable earlier in the summer which way they were going to go on this, but in the end they ended up supporting the governor's office and making possible the passage of SB 32, which affirmed California's climate goals through 2030. And I know this is something Michael has given some thought to, so I set the stage for you to maybe elaborate.
Yeah,
Put me on the spot. Yeah, well, you know, I think the California is a diverse place, and it is diverse both racially. It's also incredibly socioeconomically diverse, and you know, Chris and I live in a place, you know, that is very affluent and kind of the heart of the innovation tech economy in California. But there are large parts of California that are much more dependent on energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries, and where poverty rates are much higher. And addressing the very legitimate concerns that folks that live in those areas have for low-cost energy, forget about clean energy, low-cost energy they can afford so that they can afford to air condition their homes is incredibly important. And kind of getting that mix of policies right is a huge challenge, and I think it's really been helped by the fact that those stakeholders have really been at the table in the climate change conversation. I would just add just one slightly different point. I think the resilience question, sort of going back to your original question, Chris, the question of what are the incentives for resilience in the state and are they appropriately balanced? I think that creating the right set of incentives is incredibly difficult because it raises questions of governance, of sort of cross-jurisdictional governance, right? Pacific Gas and Electric is, in a sense, governed by the Public Utilities Commission. The Public Utilities Commission has no control over where people choose to live and where local governments choose to allow, via zoning, new construction. But PG&E does have an obligation to serve that new construction. And that raises really difficult questions about liability, risk-bearing, a whole set of questions that California is, to its credit, beginning to address, but we are only in the very early stages of that. And we see there are very interesting conversations happening in the legislature right now around wildfire insurance for homeowners. There are interesting conversations happening in the sort of broader insurance context. And I think we need, and there's some interesting planning efforts that have gone on around sea level rise, particularly in the SF Bay Area, where there are a number of incredibly valuable assets that are at sea level. like San Francisco Airport is made land at sea level, right? It's landfill, unstructured fill. So how do we protect those assets? How do we insure them? Who ultimately bears the risk? Or do we move toward kind of a Florida model where the state is the insurer of last resort, right? Those are very much alive in the California conversation, and they are about climate change. And so it's a place where this conversation hopefully will happen in a productive way over the next few years, and we'll get to some answers that can serve the state for at least a decade or two.
So it's clear that California is being faced to confront a lot of the most challenging issues in figuring out how to move forward with a climate policy. And I think that's a good point to open it up to a conversation that brings in your ideas about the conversation and where we can move and what we can do next. I see a bunch of hands. Why don't we start, why don't we start right here? I saw that hand first, but then maybe Natalie, if you pick one
Quick
back
draw.
there. Please. And if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself, that'd be really useful.
Sure. Donald Goldberg from Climate Law and Policy Project. I want to ask a question that kind of relates to the pricing issue that was talked about earlier. For decades, I guess, when pricing has been talked about, it's always kind of tended to include cap and trade and carbon taxing or carbon fee as two more or less equivalent mechanisms. Often, they're talked about together. But I think a lesson that seems to have been learned in the last decade or so is that they may not be two sides of the same coin. In some respects, they seem to be evolving in very different ways. Cap and trade is now starting to be referred to as cap and invest in some circles, whereas carbon taxes are often trending towards more towards revenue neutrality. The point I want to get to, I'm sorry for the long-winded question, is that some states, particularly here in the RGGI region, are now starting to contemplate using both mechanisms. How they will interact, I think, is still a little unclear, but I wonder about the prospects of that for California, particularly if there's a concern about getting carbon pricing up to where it perhaps should be through a cap and trade or cap and invest mechanism. And I would also just add that California is going to has a neighbor and may soon have another that is more in the tax and fee mode. So that might, add a little sweetener to it.
As the economist of record, Dallas, do you want to start with that one? Or?
I'm happy to start, but I know it's something else that Michael's been doing specific work on. I thought you framed that question extremely well. And I do think that evolution in these two programs over time is right. What I would like to emphasize that in either case, whether you're in a cap and trade world or a tax world, when you put a price on this asset, there's a valuable financial asset that's created, and it all comes down to how is that asset initially distributed into the economy, or how is that asset used. And so that's why conceptually economists say, well, you could do the same thing with a cap and trade or with the tax, but one approach or another may make this whole process more visible, more transparent, and therefore invoke a sense of procedural fairness or something like that. But you're right that the tax advocates more often these days have talked about revenue neutral taxes, and I think that's what's being, for example, in the province of Ontario, which is relevant to California because they are now, Ontario and Quebec are now linked with California. Allowances can now flow back and forth between these jurisdictions. But in the election in 2019, the party that is currently has some slight favor to win that election has argued that it wants to withdraw from cap and trade and put a tax in place that would be a revenue neutral tax. From my perspective, there's merits of both approaches, but I see this as really, a chance to gain access to that asset like crumple up the program, throw it away, and rebuild it because you want to gain access to that asset and give it to your favored use. And so it's difficult to separate the best policy design from the political interests that are advocating for one type of approach or another. It would be possible for a new party to come in and do the same thing with cap and trade, but the problem is once these investment policies are in place, it's kind of difficult to pry the fingers off of them. I think detractors of investment schemes feel that's the problem, is you're creating a long-term subsidy to some special technological interest or something. So anyway, this is the way the debate plays out.
Because that's the direction that some of the Reggie states are
Yes.
now thinking about going in.
Why don't you jump in?
Sure. So first thing I would say is I think the right way to think about this is convergent evolution. No cap and trade is a pure cap and trade. It's always a hybrid of cap and trade-like aspects and carbon tax-like aspects. And we see that in California, in the Reggie states, in the EU ETS. Hybrids are what we observe in the real world. And I think that we're likely to see, as we see, if and as we see carbon taxes enacted in the United States, we're likely to see the similar kind of convergent evolution, where there's a hybrid approach. It might be more tax-like, it might be more cap-like. I think that the sort of parallel tracks, the two-track approach that is under consideration in the Reggie states makes sense in certain respects, because so far fuels and transportation fuels are not terribly responsive to carbon prices that folks in the Reggie jurisdictions find politically tolerable. And putting transportation under a cap, such as the one that Reggie has, might lead to, as a consequence, very high carbon prices. And so there's an attempt to balance cost and environmental performance. That in that system, because we already have this cap and trade in the Reggie space that covers the power sector, is leading to a different approach to cover other emissions. You could also imagine sort of tearing that up and trying to have an economy-wide program that's one approach. But I think that leads to a whole set of kind of, if it isn't broke, why try to fix it set of issues, especially because the Reggie system is a collaboration between a large number of states, and that coordination problem is complex and needs to be nurtured carefully.
Do you want to weigh in on this one?
No.
Okay, why don't we take another? Hey, good. Why don't we take another question? Natalie, it's up to you, whoever's close to you there.
Hello. Okay. Hi, Colleen Naughton, AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at Millennium Challenge Corporation and future faculty at UC Merced, so thanks for the shout out. I was wondering, we talked a lot about, of course, energy and decreasing greenhouse gas emissions through that, or possibly transportation and industry. But if you could talk a little bit more about how California is dealing with reducing greenhouse gas emissions of their agricultural sector, and also dealing with the water issues, because climate change isn't just about carbon and greenhouse gases. I'd like to hear more about that. Thank you.
Well, California is in the process of developing what I think will be one of the most rigorous, well, let me just back up and say, if you can't measure it, you can't fix it, right? And California's approach on agriculture has been, first we need to measure, and we need to get much more accurate about accounting for what in California is called emissions from natural and working lands, so agriculture and forestry. And the state has been involved in a stakeholder initiated and has been running a stakeholder process to develop a much more rigorous accounting system for emissions from agricultural lands. And I think at that point, the question is going to be how to influence behavior in a direction that favors reducing emissions, and even perhaps using agricultural lands for carbon dioxide removal purposes, right? Changing land use practices to store carbon on the land. That is a little bit down the road, and of course, anybody who's worked in environmental law in the agricultural space knows that, in general, incentives are more fruitful than regulatory approaches in the agricultural space. And I think the potential to incentivize does exist in California because of the cap and trade, right? The cap and trade creates an asset that can be used, right? That's the revenue raised from the sale of allowances by the state can be used to create incentives on the ground. It will be a process once the accounting is figured out, once the measurement problem is figured out, to design those incentives effectively so that they actually produce reductions and not just sort of payment for business as usual. But that's a process that California is very much interested in and engaged in, because without solving that problem, it's going to get, as every other part of the emissions inventory is squeezed, agriculture is going to become more and more important as a source of emissions. And so it becomes cost effective to really start looking at that issue and trying to address it.
Good.
So from a resilience perspective, since you mentioned water, and since, of course, the agriculture is a really important part of California's economy, I think that a lot of the resilience work, it's either too much or too little water, and maybe too much salty water in your drinking water supply or at your doorstep, right? So a lot of it is related to water. So I wanted to mention another challenge that is coming up and will be launched at the governor's climate change conference in September of this year in San Francisco, and that is being administered by the Bay Area Council. PG&E kicked in the first $1 million in order to kind of jumpstart it, and we're looking for a number of additional private sector partners. And really it's about trying to figure out what are the greatest resilience challenges across the state, and investing in a very similar type of model to, if any of you are familiar with Rebuild by Design or Resilient by Design, that's been funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, trying to figure out with really top-notch design teams addressing different climate change impacts in different parts of the state, how best to be designing scalable solutions to really kind of move us into better understanding of how we can be adapting to a changing climate. I just wanted to preview that for folks in the room, because that is going to be a really amazing conference at the end of this year in September.
Thanks. I actually would like to add one comment to this emissions from other sources issue. And one of the big challenges we face in California, of course, is that climate change impacts already are tending to drive big emissions from the natural and working land sector. These horrific wildfires we had in the last several months were a vast emission of carbon. Every time there's a drought, there's a loss of soil carbon from rangelands and croplands. And trying to figure out how to put reasonable policies in place that encourage increasing stocks at the same time we're facing climate change impacts that are tending to decrease them it's a multi-body problem that nobody really has the answer to yet, and finding the answer so that we can put reasonable policies in place is going to be a big challenge. Okay, why don't we go over to this side? Lee, it's up to you. Many hands to choose from.
Hi, Michael Leifman. I'm an independent consultant in town. So Dallas, you had mentioned the importance of vehicle electrification as one of the routes towards decarbonization. Kit, you just mentioned resilience by design, I think is what you said. So, I totally agree that we need more electrification of other sectors in order to help solve the climate problem. But one of the things perverse outcomes, I guess, is that it makes the resilience problem more difficult, right? Because if more of the energy resources are concentrated in one sector, then coming back from some disaster or being resilient to some disaster just is more difficult. This concentration of resources. So, resilient by design, how do you think about that? How does PG think about that from building out an EV infrastructure in California? What is a resilient by design EV infrastructure?
What an interesting question. So in terms of, there's lots of, so let me take one giant step back. Rockefeller Foundation's conception of what resilience means is very broad-ranging. It's not just climate resilience. It's resilience of communities to other shocks and stressors as well. So I'm going to try and answer your question from a couple different ways. Recognizing that mobility challenges in the state of California also significantly impact disadvantaged communities in rural areas. We do have a program in place along with IBEW and
What's IBEW?
Sorry, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Have an office somewhere right around here. I'm sorry to our NGO partner that is not coming to my mind right now off the top of my head, but in the Central Valley, because electric vehicles are not necessarily geared very well yet through design at poorer communities, because they typically live in high-rise types of buildings. In urban communities, how do you get electric vehicle charging infrastructure there? And in rural communities, how can you incentivize something that's very expensive, requiring, you know, potentially a huge upgrade of your electrical panel that you can't afford? You can't afford the car. So what we are doing is a pilot program where we're providing free upgrades of electrical panels and funding to cover costs, half price costs of used electrical vehicles in that area, to try and see how that works and see what the adoption rate is. And there sure are a lot of electric vehicles that are kind of reaching a second generation. And so there are a number of them out there. So that's one way that we're looking at it. But in terms of trying to figure out resilience of California's electricity system overall, there is a lot of thought about having cars plugged into the grid as being a source of resilience. And so that's another potential answer to your question, but it's very complicated. I hear what you're saying in terms of fuel switching and having more dependence on electricity. You know, there are bills in the California state legislature to have us be 100% electricity. And so I think it's an ongoing debate about how best to be continuing to have a diversified and resilient power supply. Good question.
Go back over on this side. I don't mean to be ignoring the middle.
Hi, Kareem Farhat. I'm a consultant with the Boston Consulting Group and a Stanford alum. My question is primarily to Michael, who you know, I'm happy to see and always good to hear him talking. So you talked about this gap between the 70 million ton and the 140 million ton up to 2030. In addition to electricity growth, so in addition to basically expanding electrification into transportation and industry, is there a potential to cover that gap also by turning California from a net importer to net exporter of electricity? And is there a market potential, but more importantly, are the Air Resources Board regulations written in a way that allow you to account for these emissions that you're offsetting in another state?
That's a great question, and it raises, nice to see you, former student of mine. It raises a number of complex issues around regional governance of the electricity system in the Western United States. The favorite word that people who study the WEC, the Western Grid, use is balkanized when they talk about governance. And there are I think 37 balancing authorities. The California Independent System Operator is one of those in the West. And there is a very active conversation about creating a multi-state regional grid operator and wholesale market operator in the U.S. and in the West. And that could be that the California ISO expands. SPP recently moved into Colorado and got the Cal ISO nervous. SPP is another grid operator that operates in the sort of the mid-south of the country, north of ERCOT, north of Texas. And they run a market for trading electric power and ensure grid reliability. In addition, the grid operator in this neck of the woods, called PJM, has announced that they are exploring developing a multi-state Western market. So it's kind of like the competition is on to figure out who will be the one to rule them all, to extend and I think whatever happens, it is likely that there will emerge a regional market for power. That will lower the barriers to trade across these balancing authority lines. Right now, if PG&E wants to buy cheap wind power from the wind belt, you know, in Wyoming or Colorado, where you have this really great wind resource, they have to pay a transmission access charge to get that power across every one of those balancing authorities, and they add up like a stack of pancakes. And having one grid operator will facilitate those trades that benefit all parties, right? That give the Wyoming wind operators access to a really valuable market and give California ratepayers access to really low-cost green power. There are complications, though, because it's not likely that anyone other than California is going to want, in the West, is going to want to have California's suite of climate policies. Working out how we manage that climate and electricity system disconnect is the key challenge. And I think folks in California are working hard on that at Cal ISO, at the ARB, but it is a work in progress, and at the legislature.
Do you want to say anything about the issues of grid integration and how PG&E feels about these markets?
So I'm still a baby at PG&E. I've only been there for a year, and my focus has been on climate resilience, so I'm not an expert in that. But if folks have follow-up questions, I can direct you to the right person.
Okay, thanks. Why don't we take one in the middle here, and there's a bunch in the middle.
Hi, Colin Cunliffe, AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. Mike said something interesting: if you can't measure it, you can't fix it. And so I thought, Kit, that sets up perfectly the question of improving resilience. How do you measure resilience? Do you have any metrics that PG&E uses, and how does PG&E go about cost and benefit valuation of resilience investments?
Yeah, great question. So I sit on this technical advisory committee to the governor's office that I mentioned earlier, trying to figure out how we're going to coordinate state and local governance on climate resilience. And we have had several sessions of that committee focus on what are some metrics that we can use. And at this point, we're focused on process-related metrics because that's as far as we can get. And it's also really hard to have metrics that you can then aggregate statewide. So it reminds me of my time at USAID when we were trying to, in 40 countries around the world, come up with metrics around resilience that could then be aggregated agency-wide. And what the aggregated metric was number of individuals or institutions with increased capacity to deal with climate change impacts, which, what does that mean? But it was a way to take individual programs and roll it up into a number that we could hopefully see increase over time. It's not a particularly useful metric. So for now, in the government, really focused on process-related metrics. And in fact, a really great thing has come out of these types of committees. Guidance from the state of California was released at the end of last year, which essentially guides all state agencies to start using high greenhouse gas emission scenarios for planning purposes before 2050. So that eliminates some of the uncertainty around, all right, do we use RCP 8.5 or all these different various climate change models in terms of trying to predict what we're going to see in terms of downscaled impacts for climate change. In terms of metrics that PG&E is developing, that is a big part of our work plan for this year. And we're trying to look at metrics from an equipment perspective, from an operations perspective, from a safety perspective, and also from a perspective of our partnerships with all the communities that we serve, because every community is going to have a different take on what they want to invest in terms of resilience. And another really big challenge is, since there isn't the kind of regional governance structure within the state of California to try and unite the different city-based or municipal-based resilience strategies that are emerging, that's a very challenging situation. And you do occasionally find, anecdotally, and not to be attributed to any mayors in particular, but two coastal cities very close to one another. One wants to harden all assets. The other one wants to have some managed retreat and some ecological buffering, and they're really close to each other. So those two strategies are going to undercut each other. And so if you don't have that kind of regional structure, that's a real problem. And that's partly why this Resilient by Design initiative funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, which just announced earlier this month or the end of last month, 10 winning awards around the entire Bay for resilience initiatives that can work together, is really important, because trying to get all of the local governments within the Bay Area to work together on any one, that's another balkanization, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, long-winded answer, but it's a very important question.
And just one thing I'll add is that in the area of building resilience, there really are many, many unknowns, and seeing the kind of thousand flowers bloom approach can provide some insight about metrics as well as about what works and what doesn't work. I think the big reminder we got in California from the fires is that it's really difficult to figure out how to balance your portfolio between investments in kind of real-time resilience versus preparation for disasters. And in many cases, the investments are strikingly different, and they involve different structures, different financing, different actors.
Yes.
When we go over here, we've got time for a couple more questions.
Hi, my name is Amaljean Maskas, and I work for the Association of Global Automakers. So one of the things I wanted to ask about, and not to follow up on your grid question, is we did see that last week CARB had its 50th anniversary. Mary Nichols gave some interesting conversations. And so from a political aspect, I'm going to ask each of your opinions about, with the governor leaving office at the end of this year, how you think that's going to change the landscape or not change the landscape of the movement of California in its specifically, I'm going to go with the auto industry just because I'm an auto person, and ask you what you think about how that's going to affect the next steps in the regulatory policy.
And whether you're planning on running.
Yeah, right.
I can take a first
Sure.
crack if you want. So I think that that's a really interesting question. And I think looking to history is important. Watching the transition from the Schwarzenegger administration to the Brown administration, continued strong emphasis on climate change policy. All of the front runners for governor in the race so far are big supporters of action on climate change. And let's not forget about the legislature leadership in both chambers in the state. Again, very strong leadership on climate change. So I think that my prediction is that we'll continue to be on a very positive path.
I would put a lot of attention in what happens at the House of Representatives and the change in the California delegation. It's not impossible that there could be 5 or 7 seats that were Republican seats that are Democrat in the state of California, and the House of Representatives, that because of the constituency, the demographic constituency of those districts that voted for Clinton and had large Hispanic populations, and but have current Republican members of the House who have been put at some political disadvantage because of political events over the last year. So if that changes, if the California delegation is just overwhelming, it's already strongly Democratic, but it's overwhelmingly Democratic, that's going to have a real influence reflecting back inside the state, I think, on state policies. So that's one thing I'd watch closely.
I think I'm going to sound a little bit of a note of caution here. I think that if you look at the track record of zero emission vehicle policies at the Air Resources Board, it is much more, shall we say, complex than the record in the power sector of reducing emissions. And the politics of changing consumer behavior around vehicles is really tough. You only need to look at the tremendous effort that was required to pass a relatively modest increase in the gas tax in California to see the truth of that. And that is the subject of a repeal initiative in the current election cycle, and a few of the people that voted for it are subject to recalls. So I think the real answer around how fast, and then there's the legal questions around the waiver. I think that the next governor is going to have a similar approach and a similar agenda, but I would say that the current governor and the Schwarzenegger administration before it have been ambitious, but also careful. Cars are like the third rail of California politics, and so the transformation can happen once there are enabling technologies in the market. Part of that is the work that companies like PG&E are doing to enable a new infrastructure, a new fueling infrastructure. It might be that ARB is also building hydrogen stations around the state right now. Part of the work is also the work of the manufacturers, the OEMs, in bringing cars to market that people actually want to buy, that are either plug-in hybrid or all electric. And we're seeing a lot of action there. But the real question is going to be, do consumers really want to buy them? Can they be priced profitably at a price that's really attractive? And I think the jury is still out, and we just don't know where that trajectory is going to go.
Another question over here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Yasmin Biro. I'm with the Global Environment Facility, which is a multilateral fund that supports projects in developing countries and climate adaptation and mitigation also. I was curious about your Kit's commentary about the climate screening tool that you are using at PG&E, and I was wondering how widespread, or is there an ambition to have a statewide use of climate screening tools for investment decisions, whether it's an infrastructure investment, for real estate development at community level, at city level, to kind of mainstream this risk assessment tools so that people can be more informed, or regulations actually could take place, and enforcement of regulations could take place in a more informed way for people to make investments in various sectors of the society.
So to take it, thank you for that question. I think that the development of these tools are still they're still in their infancy. We have a beta version of our tool, which is based on a lot of great data that's available on the CalAdapt website, which is managed by the California state government. So looking at all these different data layers related to climate change impacts, we are using that kind of visualization of multiple interacting climate change impacts in different parts of our service area to help guide and input into our screening tool, which flags areas of high risk when you're making prioritization decisions around which infrastructure to be investigating for maintenance and operation and retrofits, or if you're doing a new infrastructure project, what do you need to be worrying about in terms of climate change impacts, in addition to the whole suite of other things that we're planning for. So again, this is an attempt to really be integrative in terms of getting into the existing processes that we already have. Statewide, AB 2800, which was passed in 2016, I believe, established a California infrastructure working group, and it's tasked with coming up with recommendations around resilient infrastructure, and I believe their recommendations are due in July of this year. So for sure we'll be hearing from them in the context of the Governor's Summit and et cetera. So I'm not sure, because I believe the very first of those meetings just happened last week. They are public, so for those of you who are interested in listening in, you can. But that is, I think it's very much underway. And again, we're all just kind of learning from each other as we move forward. Certainly integrating this kind of new information into cost-benefit analyses that we run is a critical step of the process.
Other comments on this? So we're pretty much at the time when we said we would close. And when I'm on a panel like this, I always realize 2 minutes before the end that I forgot to say the most important thing that I really wanted to say. And so I want to give each of the panelists a chance to make one more closing comment that was the thing that you really, and it can relate to your opening remarks, it can relate to any of the questions, or it can be advice for the audience about how to improve their lives.
Okay. Do you want me to?
Go ahead.
All right. Well, I think, when I sort of step back from California climate policy and I think about, like, what's this about? Why are we doing this? I think it's really important as a state, as a small jurisdiction. It's kind of large, right? We're a large economy, but we're still a small jurisdiction within the United States and certainly globally, to stay focused on what the point is. And I think more than achieving a particular level of emissions, the point of California climate policy should be to bring a set of technologies to market and provide them with an opportunity to gain traction and kind of mind share as well, that really can transform how we generate and use energy. And And I think that the approach that the state has taken to date has really driven that forward in the power sector, and we're still seeing many of the policies unfold and kind of grow. And the key issue to watch will be whether the state can be as successful in the transportation sector over the next decade. And California has a long history of success and progress in reducing impacts from vehicles. And this may be the next stage of that. It's also, though, a more fundamental challenge because we're trying to change the fuel. But I think the goal has to be more about enabling technologies, helping companies bring products to market that everybody wants because they're better. And because that's where the impact of a state like California can really be multiplied across the country and globally.
Well, I'll pick up from there and point to an element of California's success, I think, is creating winners, creating policy winners to defend a policy and advocate for a policy in the context of a transformation that has to occur in the energy infrastructure, and which creates a lot of losers, or at least people in the fossil fuel industry are relatively disadvantaged. What California has succeeded at is creating a class of winners, creating a lot of jobs in the state, a lot of innovators, a lot of chance for venture capital. And the other thing I just really want to slip in, which no one's really going to buy the first time you hear this, it had to sink in, took years to sink in for me, the value of process in the California regulatory framework. It is enough process to drive you bananas, but it is so valuable. The public hearings, the notice and comment, just the access to the agency creates a situation in which I call it the quality assurance and quality control of public policy. For one thing, it's relevant to the current Washington environment. People come into these hearings at the auditorium at their resources board, and they have to be polite to each other because 2 days later there's going to be another hearing on something else, and they're going to be in the same room together. So the industry groups and the environmental advocates, as strident as they might be, and you can imagine in California they can be strident on their positions, they're polite to each other. And then secondly, in this framework, it like rattles the trees and all the fruits and nuts fall down and all the crazy ideas and criticisms come out, such that the agency has pretty much heard whatever the imagination can come up with and anticipating how a program or regulation might fail. And then it makes the decision with that information. So it's costly, it's time consuming, and to some small degree it's a barrier to access to organizations that don't have the ability to invest in that process. But by and large, I think it's a key element of California's long-term success.
Thank you. Kit.
So building on that theme, we're really working on building a community of practice because we're all learning at the same time in terms of what we're facing, in terms of climate change impacts, what solutions might work, which ones might not work, creating an environment where we can try things out and then hopefully share what worked and what didn't work. So we are really emphasizing community-based solutions that we want to try and learn from. The grant program I mentioned earlier, we've got our 4 initial grantees. We'll have 4 more this year, trying to really make sure that the lessons that are learned from this kind of work, as well as the partnerships that we have with the other utilities in the state and through the Department of Energy's Resilient Utilities Group more broadly across the country, that we're having this open dialogue about what works and what doesn't, and trying to figure out how to communicate that as well as possible. So it's a journey, and I was trying to think of some Lord of the Rings comment to end us up, but I can't. So eat fiber. There's your.
Okay. Well, I thank you for the Lord of the Rings theme of that. Let me just close with one thought. I'm an experimentalist, and I think that these final comments have really emphasize the value of having a crucible for trying different things, looking at the supply side, the demand side, at bottom-up and top-down approaches, at corporation-led versus government-led approaches. And it's exciting to see the ways in which California has been and can be a leader, but it's important to recognize that just having one leader out there isn't going to work forever. And if there's a single point that I always take away in these discussions of the progress we're making on climate change, it comes from my background as a climate scientist, which is that they're all good and they're all exciting, but they all seem to miss the rapidity of change that's required if we really are going to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And so the thought that I'd like to leave all of you with is that even though there's this wonderful crucible of experimentation going on and lots of progress, there's still a very critical sense in which what we need to do is find the accelerator pedal. I guess the electrics have an accelerator pedal. We need to find the accelerator pedal on the transition to an economy in which we really aren't emitting the greenhouse gases. So let me leave you with all with that thought. Thanks so much for a wonderful conversation, and please join me again in thanking not only yourselves but also our panelists.